Thank you very much indeed for that inspiring address, and it's perfectly clear from what you have said that we will be exceedingly well served by our new Ombudsman, and you touched on so many areas, both familiar and not familiar, places where we know only too well that the shoe has pinched a lot in the past, and hopefully you'll be able to make it pinch a little less badly in the future. We have a short time for questions. If some of you would like to ask questions, perhaps if you want to ask a question, you would put your hand up so that I can see you. And if you are going to ask a question, it would be helpful if you would stand up to speak, because then there's more hope that the people around you will actually hear what you're saying. Any sign of life there? There's always, there's people down, yes. Can you, yes, thank you.
Hello, Ronan Kennedy from the School of Law here. You mentioned that you would favour commercial providers of public services being brought within your remit. Would you also see that, or would you also think that the powers that the Circuit Court has to order the provision of documents to you should be extended to them as well? And the follow-on question from that, my real question is, to what extent do you think those organisations should be able to plead commercial confidentiality as a reason for not providing information? Would you see that as problematic?
It's a very timely question at the moment, because there's new legislation being passed in Northern Ireland concerning the Northern Ireland Ombudsman's Office, and one of the provisions is to set aside legal privilege in respect of the Ombudsman, because the Ombudsman conducts investigations in confidence, but to do that it's necessary to see the documents. It's possible to see the documents and respect commercial confidentiality. So I think that the answer to the question is, if somebody's providing a public service, then the public's right to redress demands that the Ombudsman should have access to the documents. And one of the things that's another issue in Ireland is the issue of people arguing with the Ombudsman's interpretation and claiming legal privilege for the advice upon which they're relying. That makes for a dialogue of the deaf, and I'm very keen to see an end to it.
Yes, well, there is, if I might just comment on that, there is, after all, the tradition that in certain cases legal privilege will be lifted to the extent of allowing the judge to read the documents without them being opened to the public, as it were, in the court. So that's what you're talking about is not unseen in the legal system already. It is a possibility. Yes.
Good evening, Ombudsman. Tom Fell is my name. I wonder if I could ask you a question as Information Commissioner. The legislation is currently before the Oireachtas, and your predecessor, Emily O'Reilly, had quite stringent views on I suppose, her view was that the Act didn't go far enough. I'm just wondering if you could say anything on the bill as you see it right now. And just something slightly different, you mentioned the losses fee scheme. I'm just wondering, I know the person involved has taken a case to the European Parliament, the Petitions Committee. If you have a view if you have any view on the fact that this was the first time the Oireachtas ever refused to accept the recommendation from your office.
Yes, I do have a view, as you might guess. The issue with freedom of information legislation, I think I implied in the remarks I made that there are areas that it could in fact be extended to beyond those in the bill. That said, I think the bill marks a significant advance on where we are at the moment. So I think what you have to say is it's substantial progress, but there will be areas for the future where I think more progress will be possible. on the lost at sea issue, it's inevitably the case that from time to time, public services ombudsman will have recommendations rejected. I think it's always only a matter of time. What you have to make sure of is that it's not a habit. Now, the issue I have, let me give you an example from another jurisdiction. Anne Abraham, the UK Parliamentary Ombudsman, the last UK Parliamentary Ombudsman, produced a major report on Equitable Life Pension Fund, which involved thousands of people and millions of pounds. It was rejected by the government of the day. The subsequent government then reinstated many of the recommendations, and many of those pensioners received a pension that they otherwise would have lost out on. So in that sense, I think, should you walk away from them once they've been turned down once, then the answer is you shouldn't. Now, we do have a mechanism here, Public Services Oversight and Petitions Committee, that has taken evidence. That was set up as a consequence of this. So we do now have a mechanism where at least the Ombudsman has somewhere to go to make the case for compliance. But I would be very disturbed indeed if there started to be a pattern of not complying. Thankfully, it's an isolated incident. But there are occasions, I think, where you do have to say in a democracy that if the Parliament votes in a particular way, then you just have to respect their decision.
Yes, there's there at the back, and then this lady in the front. Then
I take it like a PhD candidate here in the School of Law. Just in your published speech online, there's a few issues dealing with the initiatives to cut the case handling rate and to improve it, and initiatives you want to take. I'm wondering if you could possibly bring us up to speed on what some of those initiatives might be, and could you maybe address that some of them, or I've heard reports that some of the older cases you're looking at jurisdictional or procedural issues to try and set them aside rather than necessarily actually adjudicate on the actual access request.
My experience elsewhere was in dealing with cases so that the longest an investigation took was a year, and I set 100% target for achieving that. What I didn't have to face was the scale of the reduction in staffing that the office faced in Ireland, so it's not an exactly comparable. But I would want to move to a position where those backlogs are eliminated, and there'll be a variety of ways of doing that. Some of them we are getting some additional resources, and I will be pressing for additional resources where we need them. Some of them are to do with looking at eliminating processes within our systems which don't add value. So if you look very carefully, there are often elements of multiple handling of complaints by individuals and so on. It's dull. Performance management and systems management are not the stuff of fascinating discourse, but that's where the hard graft in actually getting the systems working as well as they possibly can. And one of the advantages you have as an ombudsman, public service ombudsman, there are other people doing the same job. And many of them have come up with innovative ways of tackling these problems. And I think we'll be wanting to learn a lot from some others who've been particularly successful in driving down processing times. A lot of it for me comes down to trying to stop complaints coming into the system which have no possibility of a successful outcome. So, or which can be dealt with very quickly at the front end. Now, the office is very good at doing that, but I'm hoping we can get a little bit better, and the more often you can persuade a public body to deal with the issue itself rather than have it come into the office for consideration, I look at it and just go back and say, look, sort this out. The more often you do that. I was asked today, was it because people feared the office of the Ombudsman? I said I prefer to think of it as healthy respect, but one way or another you can often get a result by bringing up as an Ombudsman that you won't get, that the individual themselves weren't able to get. So So there's a lot, there isn't a simple answer to that question, but it's about making the office run to its maximum potential and about finding the most effective way of dealing with each individual complaint.
Thank you. And there's a lady in the front here, yes.
Good evening, my name is Julianne from the Master's Programme in Public Advocacy and Activism. So I was delighted to hear you mention advocacy in your role.
Yes.
I just have two questions. You mentioned the HSC in a number of your examples. So I was just wondering, are they prominent in the backlog that you'll have to deal with? And secondly, the Constitutional Convention was something that was mentioned earlier. So with the economic, cultural and social rights, which under that comes the right to health for everyone, equal health, what kind of effect will that have if it's brought into the Constitution?
The HSE features in a lot of backlog cases because some of the issues are very complex and they quite often relate to the kind of things I was talking about in the examples, cases where there have been inconsistent approaches and things have been centralised, things where the legislation is, for instance, the legislation on married couples accessing the over 70s medical card means that if they're separated, the law requires them to be treated as a married couple. If they don't speak to each other, they can't put an assessment, they can't fill a form in, they won't fill a form in together, and people just miss out, money's being counted twice and so on. So there's all these kinds of anomalies. There's no quick and easy solutions to them. There was a huge tension between the office and the HSE. I think it had reached a point where it was getting in the way of getting the work done. So I've established a high-level dialogue with the HSE where we're actually trying to speak about the difficult cases before the positions become entrenched, so that we can actually try and get negotiated ways forward.
Oh, you're successful.
Well, yes. I mean, you will be issuing a press release jointly shortly on one case we've managed to resolve. So the thing about this, people talked about the relationship between the Gardaí and the Garda Ombudsman, and there was some surprise that it might be tense. Well, I have to tell you that any ombudsman doing their job
Yes, it should
has difficult relationships with bodies in their jurisdiction some of the time. It's how you manage it so that it doesn't turn into a dispute on every case is what really manages to allow you to make progress. Now, I think that the issue about it's very much easier for an ombudsman if there's a clear right of an individual to something. It's very much easier to deal with the cases, so that as rights become enshrined within the Constitution, then that actually gives you a frame of reference for looking at individual cases. I talked about the way the Equality Act, for example, is not Constitution, but it does give you a frame of reference for looking at, was that fair? Because that's often what you're asking. It's not, was it legally compliant, was it right, was it fair? And so having a clear description of rights, well, certainly makes life much easier. Can I just say one of the other things that I'm very keen to do, that there has been some mention of equality and human rights. I'm very keen to make sure that when we look at cases, that the human rights dimensions of those are fully taken into account, so that you're not just looking at how compliant was it with that bit of legislation, but also where somebody's, for instance, right to a home, was that impinged upon by, and so there's a hugely successful initiative in Northern Ireland developing the human rights dimension of the work of the Ombudsman in conjunction with the Commissioner there. And I'm hoping that we can, that part of the outcome for that is a very good training program for staff. I'm hoping we can gain some advantage from that by working together. Not reinventing the wheel is probably one of the things we're keen to do.
Thank you. Yes, right at the back, there's somebody there. Yes. But no, there's, yes, sorry, yes. Well, okay, well, you go ahead then first. Thank you, and then we'll take the person at the back.
Coming to Galway on a wet Wednesday night in February, and it's a brave man who'll do it, to an LL.M in public law class, who are so briefed in public law. Well done. I want to ask a little question. Most of the issues dealt with by the Ombudsman are on an individual basis. What I want to sort of probe a little bit really is where you come across systemic breaches of good administration. How you would cope with that? Is there an absence of powers, maybe? The corollary to that question, of course, is whether you can take complaints from classes or groups affected by the same systemic breaches. Just to see how you feel about that.
Systemic investigations are things we can do. We generally have to take a complaint from the individual. One of the things the 2012 Act did bring in was the right to own initiative investigations. So if a group of people approach me to say you need to look into this, then we do have the powers to do that. That's important. It's not the case, for instance, with the UK Ombudsman, don't have those powers. So that was an important development in 2012. The powers, I think, are sufficient for the purpose of doing it. We do it often, I think. The frustration you would find is you might look at something in one place, and without own initiative powers, you can't then go and see if the same thing is happening elsewhere. We can do that. It simply becomes a resource issue. As any ombudsman will tell you, you have to choose your systemic investigations carefully because they can tie up a substantial number of people within the office. So you need to make sure that the one you're going to investigate is one where there's a significant benefit would come from undertaking.
Yes, well, there was a gentleman right at the back here who got kind of pipped at the post there earlier.
Thank you, Éo Cullen, a graduate of the Masters in Public Law. And I note that in a former life you headed up the Welsh Arts Council, so you probably have a penchant for drama. And given that the Irish Language Commissioner leaves office this coming Sunday due to state inaction as he sees it, and given that the Garda Ombudsman finds himself in the centre of a High Court judge review, do you feel that you come into this office at the best of times or at the worst of times?
I certainly come in at an interesting time. That may well be as in the Chinese curse.
Yes.
Yeah, I did ask, do we ever have quiet days? I was told no. I think there are advantages and disadvantages to all of this. Certainly Emily's tenure and her predecessors has left this office very well established. And from that perspective, there's also the sense that there is a minister interested in reform, and there are opportunities, I think, to strengthen the role of the office. On the other hand, there are challenges facing some of our colleagues. One of the things that I did before taking this job on was to bring the Irish Ombudsman together as a group when I was chair of the British and Irish Ombudsman Association. That's now become well established, so the group of Irish Ombudsmen now meet under the chairmanship of Kieran Fitzgerald, the Garda Ombudsman. So at least there is a forum for sharing the frustrations and for the support. Sean O'Quiran, for instance, came to discuss with his colleagues the day after the announcement of his resignation at committee. I think an enormous amount of these things depend upon public support. Ombudsmen don't really rely just on the constitutional position. You have to have moral authority. You have to be able to speak out. You have to be able to talk. The profile that somebody like Emily had publicly speaking out on behalf of the people who brought complaints to her is fundamental to keeping the office in the eye of the public. And I noticed a number of people made comments about the fact that if Emily were the Ombudsman, that wouldn't have happened. Well, I don't think they quite realised that she'd never been the Garda Ombudsman, but I think if my mettle is tested, you'll be able to judge yourself. But I do have a reputation for stubbornness, and so I'll be working hard to protect the integrity of the office. But I think they are challenging times, and I think we need to have a debate about governance about the way parliamentary democracy works, about the way the institutions of the state are accountable, about the level of resourcing available to scrutiny. All of those things, I think, we're ripe for a debate. The wrong time to start it is in the heat of argument, because it'll be coloured by the anecdote that surrounds the current one. But one of the things that, for instance, may come out of the debate about, the flip side of the Garda Ombudsman argument about the bugging issue is that there are proposals on the table to allow them to look into the penalty points issue. There are proposals on the table to allow whistleblowers to go to them rather than the confidential recipient. So I think, good things can come from this, but they'll only come from it if people, and that will include people within the academic establishment, speak out in favour of good governance. If you were to measure some of the arrangements in Ireland against the membership criteria for international ombudsman organisations, we would fall well short in some instances of what the international standard is. And when you go and talk to people, let's say from Africa or from Eastern Europe, the way in which their offices have been established, the fundamental role within the constitution of those offices, the commitment to human rights and so on, really marks them out as being in some ways better established than some of the older offices, because standards move on. So I think at some stage a review of how things are done is going to be needed.
Yes, I just, if I might again just comment, during 2012 I was employed by the Minister for Foreign Affairs to, under the auspices of OSCE, when Ireland was chairing OSCE, to go to a number of different countries looking at human rights issues and freedom of religion issues. And during the course of that, I met a number of ombudsmen in different, particularly Eastern European countries, and it certainly struck me what an important role they played in those jurisdictions. But also, I think, perhaps because there was more need for them in a way as well, and also because people mightn't have had so many other places that they can go and complain. The Ombudsman seemed to fulfill an enormously important role in those other countries. But I do think that the present, perhaps there can be some good taken out of the present difficulties, in that it is drawing the attention of the public to the necessity for the independence of the Ombudsman position and for the important role that they serve, particularly in regard to the GSOC question and indeed the Irish language question, where last Saturday there was a large demonstration in Dublin of persons who were devoted to the Irish language, as it were, protesting about what has happened over Commissioner Natjangan. And I think that the very fact that there's public attention to it may help to bring about some of the strengthening and reforms that are needed. Some of the reforms, for instance, that were set out by, in her interesting interview by NUI Galway, who was the police ombudsman in Northern Ireland some time ago, but who obviously very well understood the issues that are being discussed at the present time. Now, could we take just two more questions? I think we will be having, as you may know, there's going to be a reception in this same venue when we finish, and some people who have missed out on questions may be able to come and talk to Peter during the reception. So there's a gentleman right at the back there, and one more person. Yes, there's a gentleman here in the front. No, I think you. Yes, thank you. Right.
How are you doing? My name is Rory Hearn. I'm a lecturer in Maynooth, so it's nice to be here in Galway. I'm here with Paura Kenna. There was a question I thought, and when you mentioned there about speaking truth to power, and I'm sure you've thought about it, considered it in terms of your the role that you've taken, that when you look at it, what's happened over the last number of years, you think of what's happened to the Equality Authority, the Combat Poverty Agency, that those who speak truth to power in Ireland seem to lose their funding very quickly. And indeed, I was at a launch of a report by Brian Harvey, who did analysis of what has happened to community and voluntary projects. And I was thinking that a way that you might assess your effectiveness is to, if your budget is dramatically reduced in the next number of years, that you might see yourself as being successful. But aside from that joke, but I just wonder, is it something that you can look into in terms of what's happening to those voices who would support people to bring forward complaints? Because it was something that I was thinking as well around. I worked as a community worker in an area of disadvantage for many years, and I remember looking at the Ombudsman report and seeing issues of housing complaints, and very small amounts of them relating to local authority housing. Yet where I was working, there was huge breaches going on, but because people aren't in the position to put forward a complaint, I was just wondering what mechanisms, or is there mechanisms there that you can support organisations or individuals, to be empowered to bring forward a complaint, because that's part of the problem. Thanks.
I think one of the things we certainly can do is making it easier for people to complain, so that if somebody wants to ring up or send an email or do it in whatever way that suits them, do it on the website, and then we can do that. I think the role of advocacy bodies is a troubling one, and it's not unique to Ireland, unfortunately. When public funding gets cut, often the first bodies to suffer are those who are not providing a direct public service in the sense of providing housing or providing healthcare, but are actually providing support for individuals, and particularly advocacy. I think that's very problematic, because it does indeed lead to people not having a voice. I think it's very difficult. I mean, my job is not to campaign other than on behalf of people who've brought complaints to me to have those things put right. So it probably, the responsibility for that work is going to lie elsewhere. But I can certainly lend weight to it by highlighting the difficulties people are experiencing in making complaints. But I would also hope that some of the initiatives designed to simplify the process of making a complaint to the public body and of signposting people might help to make it easier for people as well. But I've every sympathy with the situation for an awful lot of people who are vulnerable for one reason or another. The business of complaining is both difficult, but also it can actually be threatening in the sense that they feel that they are so dependent upon, let's say, their GP or whoever the organisation might be, that to fall out with them will lead to direct personal disadvantage. And so, clearly advocacy bodies have a huge role to play in helping those individuals. We can only hope that we see some return as the economy improves, but we will certainly be happy to raise those kinds of points if there is an audience.
Thank you. And this gentleman here then.
Christy O'Carroll, and I'm one of the representatives of People Talk Jury here in County Galway. My question, I think, has practically been answered already, but it was just that we have a feeling that the ordinary citizen is not that much aware of the role of the Ombudsman or how they can access it, and for which type of complaint they can put forward. And I think that we need some more information on that. I understood that some years back that there were brochures and flyers and all sorts of things there supposed to be delivered to every house in Ireland at one time, and the end in some attic, I don't know where they finished, but they didn't get round. And I'm just asking, is there going to be some way of getting more information out to the ordinary citizen about how to access the Ombudsman?
I think one of the things try to do is to use the media as much as possible for that purpose. Emily O'Reilly was particularly good as a former journalist at getting coverage, but I've had reasonable access, so I was able to tell listeners to Galway Bay FM today how to go about complaining to the Ombudsman and what they could complain about, and I'll be taking other opportunities of that kind. I did in previous life have ads on the back of every bus in Wales, except those in Clandrindod, Wales, which somehow managed to escape the net, and also ran radio advertising. So those are the kind of things I've done in the past and will certainly consider. But it seems to me one of the really important things is that people know about the office when they need to know about it, and that's about bodies in the jurisdiction signposting people to the office when they complain. And so we're going to conduct an audit of the organisations in our jurisdiction to make sure that they're doing that. And I'm also very keen to introduce some standardised wording for them to use, so that the message is getting across in a consistent way. Because for people, when something goes wrong, you make a complaint to the body, you need to be told how to come to the Ombudsman at that point. The reality is, and I think a lot of people have done research on this, that generalised publicity about the Ombudsman's office tends not to be as effective as targeted publicity, because the people who want to know about it are the people you need to talk to. Trying to tell everyone about it tends to just dilute the message.
Thank you very much. Well, I think that in all fairness, you have more than done the very best you can, and done more than you were really required to do in answering so many questions, and so courteously and so fully. So I just can end by asking everyone to thank the Ombudsman in the customary way by a round of applause. And to invite everyone to stay for a while for a reception. And as I say, if you missed out on your question, you may be able to corner him at the reception if he can bear any more. Thank you very much indeed, everyone, for being such a good audience.